If you've got some way of communicating,
They said this mic should come off.
detach, yeah. You might have more. Hello, good evening. Welcome. This is our community forum. I'm Tom Burgess. Before I continue, I want to just thank and appreciate that Dick Dunning and Alan Edelkine, our former chair and vice chair, have shown up and here. I don't know if it was muscle memory that just carried you here without even being aware of it, but we appreciate you guys, your continued involvement with the school board after all your many years. I'm a school board representative from Peterborough, a member of our school board's communication committee. Excuse me for reading stuff I should know, but I write it out ahead of time for that reason. Our committee stages several forums every year to present information about important topics affecting our school district and to hear from the Conval community. Tonight's forum is on school funding and property taxes. We will start with a presentation on this topic from the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. The Funding Fairness Project's mission is to inform the public about the condition of New Hampshire's public schools, how they are funded, and to advocate for changes to make New Hampshire's educational system more equitable for students and taxpayers alike. In the last 3 years, this nonprofit group has given 50 presentations on this subject to school districts, school boards, and towns throughout New Hampshire. Following their talk, members of the school board will join the Funding Fairness Project group on stage to answer questions, both from our in-house audience and from people watching online. Please keep your questions short so that everyone has the opportunity to be heard. Questioners are asked to limit their questions to 2 minutes at the most. And now, here are our presenters, John Tobin and Noah Talerski.
So it's wonderful to be here. And before we start, I just want to salute the Conval School District for standing up about school funding and property taxes for more than 6 years. You should be very proud of that. And yesterday I talked to your lawyer, Michael Tierney, told him I was coming here and that I would give him a shout out, and I want to give him a shout out. He's worked very hard for you all. He and Elizabeth Ewing in his law office. It ain't over yet, but we hope we're going to make real progress real soon. So Noah is the project's communications person. He's going to desert us in the end of the summer and go to law school, God forbid. But he's done a wonderful job along with Casey. I don't know where Casey went. Oh, she's still checking people in. We have great staff who make this work, and we are very lucky to have them. And so I just want to shout out to Casey and a shout out to Noah for all of that. So the School Funding Fairness Project, our job is to advocate for students and taxpayers. And before we start, I just wanted to tell you how I got into this. I got into it from the taxpayer side because I was a young legal aid lawyer up in Berlin, in New Hampshire, in Berlin, New Hampshire, and I was a relatively new parent and a new homeowner, and I heard about the Berlin School District having a meeting about their school budget, and I decided I'm going to march down there and tell them how they should spend whatever they need to spend so my kids get a good education. But when I got there and I looked around the room, I saw a number of my elderly neighbors, and what they said is that they cared about the Berlin schools. They'd gone to Berlin schools. Their kids had gone to those schools, but they couldn't afford the property taxes. And that then and there is where I saw that what the state does is it pits taxpayers and students against each other because the state doesn't do its job. So ever since then, I've worked on this. And I had lots of clients who came to legal aid because they were about to lose their homes because they couldn't pay their property taxes. And we often found a way within the law to help them save their homes, but there were many, many who didn't come to legal aid, whose homes weren't saved. So that's how I got into this. So our agenda, and I don't know if you can see it from there, is basically on the left is the three sort of main themes. Neither students nor taxpayers are treated fairly by the current system. The problem is getting worse. It's gotten a lot worse in the last 10 or 15 years. And you all know that, I'm sure, from your property tax bills. And the current system is unconstitutional. So we're going to try to use that Constitution and protect people's rights to change it. So this is, on the right is a little outline of what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about a little introductory stuff, and then about the Constitution. And then later on, I'm going to talk about the two lawsuits that are pending. And Noah's going to talk a lot about the current adequacy formula or inadequacy formula. And then he's also going to talk about some of the things going on and not going on in the legislature. So, but the first thing we like to do is just do this little exercise. So we're comparing two school districts here. And the first ways we're going to compare them are data or metrics about school performance and education. And then we're going to have a few about taxes. So you can see public high school A, the scores on math and reading are much higher than public high school B. The number of kids who graduate is much higher in school A than B. The kids who take AP tests do much better at school A than B. And we don't have it up here, but kids, there are a lot more kids that are able to do the AP, that have AP classes and even take classes. The average teacher salary, this is a huge metric. It's an enormous difference. So what happens a lot is teachers who learn the ropes at a school district that doesn't pay them as well, but gives them a job when they have no experience, and then they go down the road and get a job that pays a lot more. And it's not that the new job pays them millions, but it pays them more, and they have families too. The median household income, very different, school A and school B. But the property taxes, look at the property taxes. The property tax rate in school A is much lower than for school B. And we don't have the data up here, but the reason for that is the overall property wealth per kid is much, much higher in school A. So the people in school B are paying at higher rates. They're really sacrificing, but they can't possibly keep up because they don't have as much to tax. Look at the difference in the property taxes on a home, $350,000. That school B, the tax rate is higher, the taxes are 3 times as much. And guess what? School A is Portsmouth and school B is Claremont. So the people in Claremont really sacrifice, they really sweat, they have to pay a lot higher taxes because there's less value to tax, but they can't keep up. And this is as good a way as there is to illustrate the disparities in our system. The kids and the spending in Portsmouth, even with that much lower tax rate, is about $2,000 higher per kid. So in a classroom of 20, they're spending $40,000 more on their kids than Claremont is, even though Claremont's tax rates are much higher. So this is how it works now. So the challenge is that in New Hampshire, we care about education. We spend a lot of money education. We rank in the top 10 overall in how much money we spend in education. And that's a good thing. And this is a quote from Governor Ayotte. You know, we are in the top 10 of funding. The problem that she doesn't talk about is how do we raise that money? Who pays? And this is a chart that shows who pays. See those big, this is a pie chart that shows where the money comes from for public education, K through 12 in New Hampshire. And the big blue patches are property taxes. The local property tax just by itself is 61%. The swept, which looks like a property tax, smells like a property tax, comes on your property tax bill, but is nominally a state tax, is another 9%. You put those two together, we pay for our public education, more than 70% of it with property taxes. That's far higher than any other state, far higher. And you can see there's some federal aid, there's a little money from the lottery, there's some state adequacy aid, but mostly it's on property taxpayers. So Claremont, the Claremont case involved those 5 school districts. We filed it in the early 90s. Just like you have experienced with Conval, the state fought us tooth and nail, up and down, appeal after appeal, but eventually we won. And the ruling, there's really 2 main points from Claremont, 2 constitutional principles that the court affirmed. First is that the state has a responsibility to pay for the cost of a constitutionally adequate education. And I'll talk in a minute about what that means. It's sort of an awkward phrase, constitutionally adequate. But the court addressed that. We'll talk about it in a minute. But it's the state's duty for all kids in New Hampshire. And the second principle is that whatever tax the legislature picks to pay for that, the rate has to be the same across the state. So the legislature has picked property taxes in part by default, by not changing things. But the rates are supposed to be the same for the portion of education that's the state's responsibility. So what does constitutionally adequate education mean? It doesn't just mean reading, writing, and arithmetic, the cores of public education in the 1880s when I went to elementary school. The Supreme Court was very cognizant of the changes in the world and the nature of the national economy and the international economy. What their touchstone is, the state needs to pay for the things that will enable our kids to succeed locally and in the state economy and the national economy, in the international economy. And so it's beyond math and literacy. It's also technology and health and science, and all those kinds of things that we know kids need to be conversant with in order to succeed. And the court got that. They really got that. So after the Claremont decision, there was some progress made. One of the things was the creation of the statewide property tax, or SWEPT. And the rate then was $6.60, which was a lot of money because property values were much lower. So that was a statewide tax at the same rate on everyone. And they also raised money from some other taxes to send some more aid to local school districts. So in the first year or two, we really saw a difference. School property taxes went down, even if you add in what the SWEPT was imposed, that level, they still went down a lot. And you can see this in the chart for Peterborough. The dark bars are the local taxes, and the lighter bars are the state aid. And you can see that at around 1998, 99, 2000, the state bar got a little bigger. Their share got bigger. But after about 2005, we've had 20 years of backsliding. We've had 20 years of backsliding. So what has happened to local taxpayers is from 2012 to 2022, the increase of the cost of education that was put on all of us as local taxpayers was $614 million around the state. And the state only upped their aid by $47 million. So as costs went up, a huge cost shift back to property taxpayers. So this is where we are now. And it's the actual average cost per kid around New Hampshire is about $21,000 per student. Conval's is a little higher than that because Conval is a spread out district with a lot of expenses that come from that. But these are the pieces the state says they'll pay for. For every student, they'll pay $4,100, which is about a fifth of the cost of an average education. And then for kids who fit the other categories, who are eligible for free or reduced lunch, and that's a marker for poverty. Teachers and people in the education world know that kids who come from poor families have higher education needs. It costs more for the school district to help them. Then the state allots $2,100 for every kid that gets special ed. The thing about that is the actual average cost for special ed is about 10 or 15 times that. It's $29,000 or $30,000 per kid on average. So the state is contributing a tiny piece of that. And then there's a much smaller category of additional aid for districts where they have kids who are English language learners. So when the school districts don't get money, they get the $4,100 for every single kid. They only get the other stipends for kids who fit those descriptions. So that averages out to, as you can see on the bottom, a little less than $6,000 per year per kid from the state, where the average cost is $21,000. So the next thing we're going to do is have Noah talk about the current funding formula.
Thank you, John. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having us tonight. My name's Noah. I'm the communications manager, like John said. I grew up in Nashua. I still live in Nashua. I went to Nashua High School South when I was a student. And so this is how it's a little different story than John of how I've come to this work, but that's how I ended up on this stage in front of you. So as John pointed out, special education, what the state is providing in adequacy aid is significantly lower than the actual cost of special education. Now, students with disabilities are entitled to these services by state law, by federal law, and it's something that districts have to pay. Districts need to provide students the resources that they need to have a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment possible. And so for some students, that means maybe they need help with a speech therapist once or twice a week. For some students in a school district, it could be a $200,000 or $300,000 a year out of district placement because the school district can't manage the students' disabilities on their own. They need to contract out to other places. And then transportation costs are a major driver for the costs associated with delivering those services to those students as well. And so what you see here is the actual cost of special education is about 15 times higher than what the state is paying in adequacy aid for special education. There's a couple other funds that the state dips into for special education. There's something that they used to call catastrophic aid. It's now just called special education aid. And that the state uses that money to help districts provide the services that are needed to the students with the most complex needs, who have the most costs associated with fulfilling those students' needs. So in sum, the state and federal governments are only covering about 16.5% of the actual cost of special education. When Congress passed the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, IDEA, they had a goal of appropriating about 35% of all of the costs of special education from the federal level, and they've come nowhere close to that in the 40 or 50-year history of IDEA. The federal government, just like the state, is not holding up its end of the bargain and this promise that they've made to help school districts. In Conval, the average cost of providing IEP services was $41,000 per pupil. And like I said, that covers a wide range of services that students might need. That is higher than the state average. We can probably chalk a good portion of that up to transportation-related costs. And so coming back here, the the difference between what it actually costs to fulfill a student's IEP and what the state is providing is really woefully inadequate. It's not even close. And it just speaks to the fact that the state still is not holding up its end of the bargain. It's not fulfilling the promise that the New Hampshire Supreme Court made in Claremont that all students would have access to a constitutionally adequate education. Students with IEPs are entitled to these services. They're necessary for them to get that education. And if we're underfunding it like this, is the state really providing those students with that adequate education? So there was some news last year that there was less reimbursements coming out of the special aid fund than there had been in the past. It was being prorated at about 2/3. So it was roughly an $18 million shortfall from the state that they did not ultimately fill. And those are reimbursements going to school districts for services that have already been provided to students and that the taxpayers have already paid for. And there was a provision put into the governor's original proposed budget to increase that fund and make sure that there is not that proration going forward. But that's not going to help the taxpayers who have already covered that and already been, left with the short end of the stick by the state for all of these past years. So it's pretty clear that what the state is providing isn't actually representative of what it actually costs to educate students in New Hampshire. So the green bars here are what school districts actually spent on educating their students last school year. The 23-24 school year is the year that we have complete data for. We won't have stats for the current school year until January of next year when the New Hampshire Department of Education releases them. So we're working with the best data that we have right now. But you can see in every single district, what the state says an adequate education should cost is much lower than what it actually costs to educate students in that district. We have two different colors here. The blue represents the SWEPT, which the state takes credit for, but it shows up on your local property tax bill. The state never touches that money. They just tell Peterborough or Antrim or Bennington or whatever town you live in, this is what the SWEPT rate is for your town, and we are going to mark that off on our ledger as money that we have given to you. And so that gets raised on your local property tax bill, and then the orange bar is the adequacy grant that districts get from the state. That's the additional money that the state sends to school districts to get up to that cost of an adequate education. I'll point out New London on the chart here is only in blue. And that is because there's a lake in New London. They've got a lot of property value up there. And so what happens is what the state tells them to set as the SWEPT rate actually allows them to raise more money than the state says an adequate education should cost. And I think, we've been pretty clear that what the state says an adequate education should cost is not adequate. But you end up in a situation where New London doesn't get any additional adequacy aid from the state. So they're just getting the money that they collect from SWEPT, and they get to keep the extra above and beyond the cost of an adequate education. That used to not always be the case. The extra used to get paid to the state and sent to other districts. But a group of communities, they call themselves the coalition communities, lobbied to change that, and now communities retain their excess SWEPT. And John will talk more about that later. That's part of the lawsuit that he is working on. So we're going to do a hypothetical for a second. I want you to imagine a school budget and what you think you need for an adequate education. We can even just take a second, just shout out, what are things we think we need for an adequate education? Teachers? Paras, curriculum, buses, buildings, equipment, heat, electricity, water, sports equipment, administrators. Just someone in the back said it. Administrators, do we need copy machines? Nurses, textbooks, a lunchroom, people to work in the lunchroom. We do need sports equipment for gym class. We need art supplies for art class. Instruments for music. Do the teachers need to do professional development? Should they always be working to get better? So there is a lot of stuff There's a lot of people, there's a lot of things that go into making sure kids get an adequate education. So we did a hypothetical exercise with the Allenstown School District. They're a small town near Concord. When we did this exercise with them, they had about 500 students in their school district. They only have a K-8 school. They send their kids to Pembroke Academy for high school. The voters in Allenstown approved a $12.2 million budget, or roughly $24,000 per pupil. That was what was approved at the district meeting by the voters. That same school year, the state said the cost of an adequate education in Allenstown was only $2.4 million, or a little less than $5,000 per pupil. So we asked Allenstown, we sat down with the superintendent, a member of their school board, their business manager, and we pulled up their DOE 25, which is the form that gets submitted to the state by all the districts showing where they're spending all of their money. And we asked them, make cuts. What would your budget look like if you were only operating with what the state was providing you in adequacy aid? What would your district actually be able to provide to students? They had to cut a lot of stuff. We're getting rid of busing, which means we're violating state law. The state requires busing for all students, grades 1 through 8, who live more than 1.5 miles from their school. We're getting rid of supplies, copiers, no new textbooks, no art, music, or PE equipment, no Chromebooks. We're going to default on the bond on the school building. I don't know what would happen if the bank tried to repossess the school. That would be interesting to learn what would happen, and hopefully we don't get there. We're not going to have food services, no grounds maintenance, including plowing. So maybe the kids will have to bring their own shovels to school to shovel the building out when it snows. There's no school district costs. And we're violating state law, we're violating federal law, we've broken a couple collective bargaining agreements, and the list goes on. I'm not gonna read everything. There's pretty deep cuts into special education services, which are absolutely just gonna open the district up to hardship lawsuits from families of students who are not having their needs met. But you'll remember from the last slide, we got rid of all the attorneys at the school district. No clubs, sports, field trips, or student assemblies. So a lot of that stuff that really you use to get kids into the building for the day is not there anymore. Getting rid of the secretaries. We're getting rid of the crossing guards. So we've gotten rid of the school buses, and we've gotten rid of the crossing guards. So the kids are totally on their own to get into the building safely. And it goes on a little bit more. There's no subs, so that means if enough teachers are sick, not everyone knows this, but if there's not enough adults in the building, you just can't open the school. And so, maybe there's a real bad flu going around and there's not enough staff to open the building. Parents will be getting a phone call at 5 o'clock in the morning like it's a snow day, except it's not snowing. There's just too many sick teachers and they can't open the building. So we think we've gotten there. We cut a lot of stuff. Do we think we've gotten down to the state's adequate education? No, I'm hearing some no's. That would be correct. So I said Allenstown sends their high school students to Pembroke Academy. They can't control that tuition payment. Pembroke just tells them this is what you pay. So they cut it. There's another $2.2 million off the top, and that's not even enough. When we were doing this exercise, Allenstown, sort of based on the way the state statute is written and the way that the state defines an adequate education and has argued for an adequate education in court, the way that they believe it should be defined, really focuses on classroom instruction. So when we were doing this, they said, okay, so we're gonna do everything we can to keep as many teachers as possible, because that's obviously, that's what the state thinks is at the heart of an adequate education, so we agree, we're gonna try and keep as many teachers as we can. We're gonna lay off about half of them, and we've got class sizes that violate state minimum standards. K-2, you're capped at 25 students. 5 to 8, you're capped at 30. And so an adequate education in Allenstown would end in the 8th grade. We've cut all those things, we fired half the teachers, and kids are on their own for high school. And really, I will ask the question, is this an adequate education? If the justices on the Claremont court saw something like this, would they say, the state is fulfilling its duty to provide Allenstown with an adequate education? I would say no. And it's a shame because across New Hampshire, people do support their school districts. People are shelling out of their pockets to support their school districts. At town meeting, up and down the state, people are voting not for the default budget, they're voting for the proposed school district budget. They're making, there's warrants and amendments to even push the budget higher. This happens in communities all around the state. And we just saw earlier this winter when there were proposals to cap school budgets, they were universally rejected in every district they were voted on, including, I believe it was also rejected in the Conval district as well. And that didn't necessarily stop the state legislature. There was a proposal 2 days after all of these budget caps were defeated on town meeting day. 2 days later, the House of Representatives voted to pass HB 675, which would impose a school budget cap on all school districts in the state. It was more restrictive than the caps that were being proposed at the local level, and it passed by somewhere between 5 and 10 votes. The bill was ultimately killed. They tried to put it into the budget. It was taken out of the budget on the House floor. But even still, what we're seeing is the legislature, instead of doing something about its low funding for education and sending more money to districts when it is clearly not providing enough for an adequate education, instead it's trying to hamstring the ability of local districts to raise money. They're saying your property taxes are too high, it's the local school board's fault, which is something that we disagree with, and I think that the numbers show is not correct. We also had another bill this session, HB 283. This one would have cut the definition of what constitutes an adequate education. And this is a very important piece of law. This is RSA 193E2A, for anyone who wants to write that down. This is at the heart of the Conval lawsuit. This is at the heart of all of the discussions about school funding. So this is how the state defines an adequate education. When we just did that exercise where we listed all those people and things that we need to run a school, the state doesn't have any of that in statute. The only thing that the state defines as necessary for an adequate education is the opportunity to learn these 11 subjects. You have to learn logic and rhetoric, and cursive and multiplication tables are also included, but they're less important. So HB 283 would have gutted this definition. It would have taken away a whole bunch of requirements, and as a result, the state would have been able to further reduce its funding that it was giving an adequacy aid. If you are taking away all of these specifics for art and music, you don't need an art or a music teacher, the state will say, so we will give you less money for that. This bill was the single most opposed bill in the history of the state legislature's online testimony portal. Over 30,000 people registered their opposition to this, one person from every single city and town across the state. And it just goes to show, again, Granite Staters support their public schools, they care about their public schools, and they need help from the state, and instead the state is trying to make it more difficult for districts to actually do their jobs and provide students with that education that they need. So this is where we start to get into the taxes part of it. We've talked a lot about school funding. We'll go back to Claremont at the beginning. First part, you need to provide students with a constitutionally adequate education. The second part, all of the taxes used to raise money for that education need to be levied at a uniform rate. Sounds pretty straightforward, but, and I'll only say this once because John has told me I'm only allowed to say this once, the Claremont decisions happened before I was born. So clearly it can't be that simple. So we're gonna do another, this is very basic math, this is just for illustrative purposes, but the gap between these two imaginary school districts does reflect the real world disparities that exist between some of our wealthiest school districts and some of our poorest school districts. So imagine, I'll I don't know, the science wing of this building is somewhere, I assume. Let's say we want to get some new microscopes for the students because the chemistry class and the biology class are using microscopes in their labs, and they're really beneficial for the students learning about science and being excited about science. But the ones that we have are from when John was in elementary school, and so we need to buy new ones. Microscopes cost $10,000 to buy a full set. Community A, they have $1 million of property value, so they set a $10 per thousand tax rate, they raise $10,000, and they buy the microscopes. Community B, they set the same tax rate, they only raise $4,000. And the microscope store is not going to sell you microscopes for 40% of the cost. It costs $10,000 to buy microscopes. You can't get them for less. And so if you want to get microscopes, which they're important for science, we want to have them, it's going to require a tax rate that's 2.5 times higher to raise the same amount of money. And this is where the issue with our heavy reliance on local property taxes and low state aid is created. Because the state is providing so little funding, districts are required to close that gap with their local property taxes, and the communities that have the lowest property values need to set higher and higher and higher rates, and they're not keeping up with other districts. We have 2 homes here. One of them has gardens, farm fresh eggs. You could get a goat, it says. We pulled these off Zillow, so these are real home listings. I didn't write these. We also have a beautifully maintained 2-bedroom, 2-bath home, 1.18 acres. Walk or golf cart ride brings you to your own 24-foot dock on Lake Winnipesaukee. That sounds pretty nice. Which of these homes, by show of hands, do we think pays more in education property taxes? Raise your hand for the home on the left. Okay. And raise your hand for the home on the right. All right, people are saying the home on the left probably pays more in education property taxes, and it's because you've been paying attention so far. Home on the left, right here in Peterborough, market price about $700,000. So their school property tax bill in 2024 was $8,300 roughly. And I know that assessed value is different from sale value, but we're illustrating a point. This other home's in Meredith. It's on Lake Winnipesaukee. It is worth an additional $245,000. Its tax rate is less than half of Peterborough's, and it paid less in property taxes, even though it was worth more. And so this is, like John was saying before, the example we have between Portsmouth and Claremont. If Peterborough and Meredith here were trying to raise the same amount of money, Peterborough would need to have a higher tax rate than Meredith to be able to raise that much money. And so what that has led to in our state is a perfectly regressive tax system. So the more income that you have, the smaller percentage of your income you're paying in taxes every year, largely because of property taxes. And this doesn't just affect homeowners, it affects renters as well. Because if you are a renter, I'm a renter, my landlord is pretty nice, but I know I'm paying his property taxes. He's not giving me a pass on that. That's how we end up with this downward slope. You'll notice here, there actually were, until January 1st, there was an income tax in New Hampshire. It was called the interest and dividends tax. It was paid on investment income. It was repealed at the start of this year, so if you owed it, you owe it for last year. You don't have to pay it on your taxes this year. It was cut. House leadership had a celebration. They had a wake for the interest and dividends tax. And the people who will no longer be paying the interest and dividends tax, let's see, 52% of all revenue came from the 1,723 filers with more than $200,000 in taxable interest and dividends income. To put that in perspective, you'd probably need to have upwards of $5 million of investments to be generating that much interest and dividends wealth in any given year. So most of the money that's being saved is going back to some of the wealthiest people in the state. That's the decision the legislature made, and so that's where we have ended up with this. The interest and dividends tax, for reference, the last year that we have numbers for it generated about $185 million of revenue for the state. 184.3, excuse me, with most of that coming from the largest filers. And you've got 51,000 filers, so 50 times more people who paid just a little bit who now aren't paying anything. We also, and that means largely the people at the upper end of this chart are going to be paying less overall on a smaller overall tax burden as a result of this. We've also, since for the last decade, the state has been gradually reducing our two business taxes, which are the two largest sources of revenue that the state government has. There's the business profits tax, which is on profits, and then there's the business enterprise tax, which is really a payroll tax paid by businesses in the state. And we've probably left, this is from the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, they estimate that in the last decade we've left over $1 billion of tax revenue on the table that we have not collected by reducing these rates. And the revenues for the business taxes have continued to gone up, even though the rates have gone down, but business tax revenues have gone up in every other state in the country. They did not go up as a result of New Hampshire cutting the rate. They have been following national trends and going up everywhere, but because we've got a lower rate, we're leaving money's being left on the table and we're not collecting as much as we maybe could have been. And this is, again, money that the state could be using to be going towards public education or to any of the other state services that are being impacted in the state budget that's being debated in Concord right now, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So I'm gonna hand it back to John, who's going to talk about the courtroom dramas that have been going on here in Claremont and in his own case over the last couple of years, trying to fix this problem and get the state back on track to fulfilling the Claremont promise.
Thank you, Noah. That was great. I hope that all the lawsuit stuff is over by the time he gets out of law school, but I think we're in good hands if it isn't. So I want to talk about the two cases that are pending now. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this, you all can be proud of the fact that you really got this second round of litigation going in 2019. Started out with just this school district and 5 more. But since then, a whole batch of other school districts have joined you. And I think that list is really significant because it says, you know, big districts like Manchester and Derry and Nashua, and rural places, you know, like Newport and Claremont or Old Mill Towns. It really sends a message to the court that this is a problem that's just not in southwestern New Hampshire. This is a problem that afflicts school districts everywhere, no matter what their size is. And so I think that having all these people as your allies in the case really helps send an important message. And it's, as we said, it's all these school districts represent 25% of all the kids in the state. So that is really something. And the case has gone up and down, but in November of 2023, Judge Ruoff issued a ruling in favor of the Conval School District. And this case is focused solely on the base adequacy number, that $4,100. And Judge Ruoff found that that was unconstitutional. He went through weeks of testimony from dozens of people from school districts around the state who could talk about what things cost, how budgets work. And he operated from a very conservative approach of, if there's any doubt about this expense, I'm not going to consider it. But what he came up with was, instead of $4,100, $7,300. And as you can see in the green that we've highlighted, he thinks the actual cost is much higher than that, but he wanted to give the state a benchmark. He wanted to say, this is the bare minimum of what base adequacy costs. So what if the states had to pay $7,300 instead of $4,100? That would cost, as you can see, a little over $500 million. And so he said the $4,100 number is unconstitutional. One of the things that was striking about the trial, and he reflected this in the decision, is the state had no evidence to support the current formula. They did not try to in any way justify those numbers. Their approach was entirely a lawyer's approach of, we're going to try to convince the judge that you Conval people didn't prove that the number's wrong. They didn't try to support the number, and that was apparent from the beginning of the case. They're just trying to avoid responsibility. So this is a quick summary of how he got to the 7,300, and it's a little bit complicated, but those are the pieces. We talked before, Noah was calling out to you or asking you to call out the pieces that you thought were important. And so these are the numbers that he came up with for the cost of teachers per student, facilities, transportation, all those things. And obviously some of those numbers will change from district to district. In Manchester, the transportation number is probably lower. In Colebrook, it might even be higher. But he was trying to set a benchmark, and he said about 10 times in his opinion, this is really a legislative decision. Legislature, you need to go back and figure this out, but I have to give you a benchmark. I think he was trying to avoid the legislature coming and saying, well, you don't like 4,100? How about 4,200? I think he was trying to say, there's a benchmark here. You have to do real work, legislature, and figure it out. So this is we showed you the slide before about the current sources of funding. More than 70% comes from property taxes. If the Judge Ruoff number was implemented, there would be some additional state aid, not a massive amount, but if you see that yellow piece of the pie, that would be substituting state aid for some of the local property tax. So this is a very his ruling is very conservative. It's very cautious. There would be an impact. And the Conval case was argued in the New Hampshire Supreme Court last fall, and we're waiting for a decision. And we'll see. So one other thing about this, the trial was they, and I generally speaking, I have a lot of respect for the people in the Attorney General's office. They're trying to serve the state, but they were forced into making absurd arguments because the powers that be in the legislature were not doing anything about raising the money. So they ended up saying, well, you can't really say that facilities are an adequate education or transportation. And it was embarrassing. As a lawyer, it was embarrassing. I think Judge Ruoff was angry and embarrassed for the state that these people were making those arguments. That, all you need is teachers sitting, under a tree. So there was a bill that would have simply implemented the number that Judge Ruoff came up with. Needless to say, that didn't go anywhere, but if it had passed, it would have meant a little more than $4 million for inadequacy aid for this school district. So Rand is the other case. That's the one that I'm working on. And true to the my original and longstanding approach to this is a property taxpayers case. This is about the tax rates that have remained really unequal even 30 more years after the court said the rate's supposed to be the same. So we say that the rates have to be equal for raising the money for an adequate education. And they are far from it, as we've shown you a bunch of times. The rates are very unequal. And our clients are interesting. We have a hardware store owner from Plymouth, and a retired doctor from Pennacook, and a volunteer fireman from Hopkinton, and a couple of elderly people, and they struggle to pay their property taxes. All the places they live are places with less property wealth, so their property rates are high, and that means that the state is essentially jipping them out of their money because they have to pay much higher rates because the state is not paying what it should pay to the school districts in their towns. and we also took the challenge to the adequacy numbers a little further than the Conval case did. We're challenging that 4,100 number, but we're also challenging the numbers, the really low state numbers for special ed. As you may recall, it's about 2,000 per kid when the actual cost is 31,000 per kid. And so we're trying to get the judge in the Rand case to knock out the 4,100 again and to knock out those other costs. The other two things, one of the things we knew about for a long time and when we didn't, and Noah described this, that the wealthy towns that have so much property that they could raise enough for the low adequacy number, they convinced the legislature to let them keep that extra money. They're the last folks that need that extra money, but they were politically powerful, and so the thing's gone back and forth. But we challenged that. It's state money. The state says it's the state tax to go for adequacy, so it's state money, and the extra state money should come back to the state to be divvied out elsewhere. So that was one of our other claims in the Rand case. And then we found out something that we didn't know, and that's that in certain unincorporated places that are not officially a town or a city, but have valuable property, the Department of Revenue, all on its own, was, instead of imposing the SWEP tax, they would essentially eliminate it by having a negative local education tax rate. So these, and we had a picture of this, a very expensive lodge in one of those North Country places, and that place is not paying any tax, SWEP tax. So we didn't know that until we began the case. So in November of 23, right about the same time that Judge Ruoff issued the decision in Conval, he issued a decision that we requested knocking out both of these practices, saying that the wealthy communities can't keep that extra money because that, in effect, that lowers their tax rate. So you don't have a uniform tax rate anymore because they get extra. They can spend on anything they want. And they even acknowledged that they spent the money on all kinds of things, but not education. And then he also knocked out the negative tax rate thing. So that case, that part of Rand is also on appeal at the Supreme Court. We argued it within a month of when Conval was argued. We're also waiting for a decision from the Supreme Court on that. The other part of Rand that I mentioned about trying to challenge the adequacy amount and the amount for differentiated aid is we had a trial with Judge Ruoff for that last October. And the big part about that people don't understand is if those amounts are too low, that means that everybody's school tax around the state is unconstitutional because they're being paid at different rates to meet the state's duty. So big issues in both of these cases. We hope to get the decision soon. That unlike for lawyers, courts don't have deadlines for judges. And so we don't know when they're going to issue those decisions, but we hope this summer. So now I'm going to pass it back to Noah to talk about the budget.
Thank you, John. So, the main attraction in the state legislature this year is the budget. New Hampshire has a biennial budget, so it happens every other year. The state legislature works on a budget. The Senate Finance Committee voted yesterday on their proposal of the budget. Didn't have time to update the slide, and so this is a little out of date, but I'll point out what the differences are. The full Senate will be voting on the budget tomorrow, and then there will be, I'm assuming that the House is not going to agree with the changes made by the Senate, so there'll be a committee of conference, and they go back and forth, and the final vote on the budget will be on Thursday, June, I think it's the 26th. So we're in the home stretch of the budget process. The legislators have been working very hard on it. It's a big document. It's a lot of pages. But there were some small changes in the House budget for education. So overall, we're not addressing the state's inadequate amount of adequacy aid. It's still very low. We're getting roughly 2% increases to the base aid and those categories of differentiated aid. We are increasing the special education grant. That's the catastrophic aid, the special education aid that I mentioned before. That's going to be higher in the second year of the biennium, so not this coming school year, but the following one. The House did increase the differentiated aid amounts for special education by a more significant margin, and then the Senate cut those back. So those are just going to be a flat 2% increase on the differentiated aid categories. There is a expansion of the voucher program, the Education Freedom Account program. There will be no income limits on the program as proposed in the budget. The budget number estimates about $30 million increase in the cost of the program by removing the income cap. If every single student being homeschooled or attending a private school in the state of New Hampshire enrolled in the voucher program, it would cost more than $100 million a year. The state is required to pay for however many students enroll in the program, as there are, regardless of how much is budgeted for it. The general fund will backfill the education trust fund if they can't cover it. There is a bit of a cap that's been included on the number of students who are allowed to enroll, but it does increase over time. So it would eventually lead to the possibility of total universal eligibility where there's no income limit and there's no cap on the number of students who are able to participate. No major boost for adequacy aid. There was an open enrollment proposal floating around which would allow students to enroll in any public school in the state. It doesn't really lay out how it's supposed to work. It would be expensive. A lot of districts, you're probably going to end up with districts where a lot of students would leave, and then they're responsible for paying a certain amount of those students' tuition to the receiving district, but the receiving districts are allowed to set their own sort of level of how many open seats they actually have. So do you end up with a world where the Portsmouths and the Hanovers of the world just say we're full and they don't take any kids? That's also a possibility. That hasn't really been worked out. I believe that has been removed from the Senate version of the budget, but there is a separate policy bill that's being voted on by the House, I think tomorrow. I think it's HB 771. I see Representative Ames is nodding his head. Thank you. So if we expand universal eligibility for the Education Freedom Account voucher program, it could cost north of $100 million a year if you have every eligible student enrolling. It's about $27 million for this year. About 3/4 of students who have enrolled in the voucher program so far were not previously enrolled in a New Hampshire public school. So the way, just to explain it a little bit more, the way the vouchers work is if you enroll in the voucher program, the state takes your adequacy aid money, so the money that it would be sending to your school district, and puts it in your Education Freedom account where you can use it on your homeschooling or private schooling expenses. So that means for the 3/4 of students who were not previously in a public school, that's a new appropriation for the state. So that's roughly $20 million for this year is a new appropriation. That's new adequacy aid that the state was not paying before because those students were not in a public school. If a student leaves a public school, they take their adequacy aid with them. So the cost is the same for the state if a student leaves a public school to enroll in the voucher program. There was a rough compliance review that was done at the end of 2023 that found that almost 1/4 of applications had some sort of issue on them. Not all of them were disqualifying, but that is a pretty high number. The firm that manages the program makes a percentage of the total amount, 10%. Thank you. I was forgetting the exact number. 10% of the voucher program goes toward the Children's Scholarship Fund, which is a New York-based nonprofit that administers the program and is meant to be verifying all of this stuff. So this is just, that all sounds a little bleak when we've been talking about, why we think it's important for there to be change, why we think it's important for the state to be contributing more to an adequate education. And like I talked about with town meeting, the rejection of budget caps, the turnout people had opposing HB 283, people have been standing up for their public schools this legislative session. At the Senate Finance public hearing on the budget, we presented a petition with almost 2,000 signatures on it, people calling for a fair funding budget. We were circulating a letter. We had 438 local elected leaders representing 75%, or 71% of public school students asking the same thing. People are speaking up. People are trying to take action to bring about change. One of the questions that we ask, and we're coming up on questions, we're almost done, is where's the money going to come from? There's a lot of options. Really, it's whatever the legislature wants it to be. But some of the possibilities could be we could increase SWEPT. So for Judge Ruoff's Conval number, a SWEPT rate of about $5 per thousand would raise enough money to cover that base adequacy increase. And remember, that would be offsetting existing local property taxes. So like that chart we showed at the beginning of how the introduction of SWEPT in 1999 led to a reduction of tax rates across the state, a similar thing would happen where most communities would see a reduction in their tax rate if we increased SWEPT and we actually distributed the excess funding. There is currently one of the things that the coalition communities, this group of property wealthy communities, that they say when they push back against the suggestion that they should be paying their excess SWEPT to the state is that, well, just because someone lives in Meredith or in Wolfboro, that doesn't mean that they themselves are wealthy, which is absolutely true. And if SWEPT went up, someone who doesn't live on the lake, someone who has a very modest home, their property taxes could increase significantly. But there is a program to deal with this. The state does have a mechanism to help people afford their property taxes. It's called the Low and Moderate Income Property Tax Relief Program, which is a mouthful. And it helps people pay just for the SWEPT portion of their tax bill. So this is not applied to your local education tax, it's just to the SWEPT portion of your bill. And as a result of that, the claims that are paid out are fairly small because SWEPT is a fairly small portion of your property tax rate. So if we are changing SWEPT, there certainly needs to be a mechanism in which we are increasing this fund and we are helping those people not be taxed out of their homes because of the change that's happening in the SWEPT. We need to make sure that all of these changes are considering the most needy people in our state, the people with the least ability to pay. The interest and dividends tax we talked about before, the business tax, capital gains tax, these are all things that could, in theory, they would increase revenue for the state. Education's always included in as a place that would get funding in the every year when there's a bill to legalize recreational marijuana. There could be more money from the video gaming terminals, I think is the term that the state uses for slot machines. There could be a larger portion of revenue from those going into the Education Trust Fund. So there's a lot of options. The legislature has a lot of tools that they can work with, but the problem is the legislature has not been willing to have that conversation about how do we raise the money to actually be fulfilling our duties and our responsibility to give kids an adequate education. So, in summary, and we'll get on to questions, neither students or taxpayers are being treated fairly. The system is keeping educational opportunities away from students and is really jacking up property taxes in communities around the state. State leaders have been downshifting that cost. A large portion of what is raised locally should be the state's responsibility. The current system's unconstitutional, and the solution lies with state legislators. Whatever happens in the courts, and hopefully there are wins for the Conval and the Rand plaintiffs, the legislature is still going to have to pass a bill to institute those changes. And so it's up to the legislature, which means it's up to all of you. If this is something that you feel is important, it's something that you care about, it is incumbent upon you to speak to your legislator about it and make sure they are aware that it is important to you. I know that Casey, when she emails out the slides after this, will make sure that she includes a link to a tool that we have. If you would like, you can email your senator ahead of their vote on the budget tomorrow. They convene at 1:30 tomorrow, so we'll make sure you get it before then so you can email your senator. If you feel so inclined to speak up after hearing John and I talk for a little over an hour. So, talk to your legislators. Not a lot of opportunities to testify at this point. If you get on our newsletter, we will share opportunities to testify, keep you in the loop about important bills. You can email your legislators. We have some tools to make that easy for you. You can submit online testimony like people did for HB 283. You can follow us on social media, write letters to the editor, and just talk to your neighbors and friends. You know, if everyone in here talked to 4 people and they talk to 4 people, you start to get that exponential effect of more and more people learning about this, which is why we go around the state with the slideshow and talk to people. So that is all we have to say. I'll have Curtis and Tom and John come up and we'll do questions. If anyone wants to leave, this would maybe be a good time to leave before we get into the Q&A. But thank you again very much for having us. I appreciate your attention and sharing an evening with us when I hear there's a playoff baseball game happening that you could be at instead.
We can kind of project onto us. Are you going?
Sit down here.
Oh, okay.
So we're not.
New approach.
What?
I like it. Makes the people filter out a little bit. Hi, everybody. My name is Curtis Hamilton. I'm the school board rep for my town of Greenfield. Thank you all so much for coming. Really a great turnout. If anybody has a question, please come up to the mic.
So I've heard some legislators say that the EFA, it doesn't cost anything for the school districts and for the local taxpayers because it's all new money because they're not going to this public school anyway. But if I understand this correctly, you're saying that if they currently go to the public school and then switch to a private school, then it does cost the local school district those funds. That's correct? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so if a student is currently enrolled, the adequacy aid follows them as part of their voucher. So if someone's currently enrolled and they leave the district loses that funding. But again, it's been like there's this year a little over 5,000 students enrolled in the program. About 1,500 of them, 1,200, 1,500 of them left their public schools. So that's a pretty small percentage. There's 154,000 public school students in the state, so it's not a huge number.
If I may, regarding the EFA conversation, Conval over the last 3 years has only lost 14 students due to switching out of the public school for an EFA. The school district still received $43,455 for the phase-out grant for those students who did leave. So if anybody here is not familiar with the phase-out grant, that's a 2-year grant. The first year, the school district receives 50% of the adequacy that student who left was receiving, and the second year, they get 25%. So as a result, Conval's received $43,455 so far, with only 14 students having left this district.
So, being so close to our neighboring states like Massachusetts and a bit further, but Vermont, I was wondering, what do the costs, like if any research has been done per pupil at those states, what does it look like?
The cost, I think, is similar. Though Massachusetts and Vermont are, like New Hampshire, high-spending states compared to Mississippi or Alabama. And especially Massachusetts is a high-achieving state. I think it's the state with the best, either Massachusetts or Connecticut or New Jersey, is the state with the best test scores, the best educational outcomes. And both of Massachusetts and Vermont also had lawsuits. And their legislature responded and changed the funding formula and took a lot of the burden off of local property taxpayers. Not all of it, but a significant amount of it. So this is a problem that occurs in many states, but other states have dealt with it much more readily and fairly than ours has.
Thank you.
So how much of the cost of a private education does a voucher actually cover? And who has access really?
Well, I just happened to read something about that. And there are different, there are different kinds of private education. There's a traditional prep school that costs $60,000 or $70,000 a year. Some vouchers are going to those, but most of the vouchers have been going to private Christian schools. And those schools contribute to the cost. A number of them contribute to the cost from their congregations, and they get other funding from that. The other big thing about all of those schools is they don't have to take special ed kids. And we've seen the average cost of a special ed kid is $31,000 around the state, and in this district it's even higher. The voucher program says you can have this state money, taxpayer money, but you don't have to take special ed kids. And some of them will take kids with sort of mild disabilities, but they don't take the ones that need out-of-district placements or extensive services. So that's one of the ways they save money.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm also thinking about, like a family that might not have a whole lot of money, if they can't like cover the difference between the voucher and the actual cost of the school, or, like are working hard and don't have the time or the ability to bring the kid back and forth to school every day, our kid's going to be left behind.
I mean, one of the issues with vouchers is accountability. There's been some reports about some of that money being spent on skiing. And skiing's a wonderful thing, but I'm not sure it's an adequate education. And so there is very little accountability about how that money's being spent. And very little accountability about how the kids are doing. Are they getting an education? Would they pass the tests they need to pass? And the proponents of the vouchers have really resisted that kind of accountability. So I care about all kids. I don't just care about the kids in public schools, but I worry about some of those kids who may not be getting much of an education.
If I could add, before you ask your question, if you could state your name. Thanks.
Yep, Pat Troy. Thank you so much for the presentation and all the research you guys have done the past couple of years. It's really informative and a great resource. What I was going to ask was, if you guys were given a blank slate to kind of start all over and develop the most fair funding formula, what does your research indicate would be the most fair way to fund education? And then furthermore, similar to what I think 2 people ago said, what state is doing it best from a funding fairness perspective, or a couple states that are doing it best? You referenced Massachusetts, New Jersey, Connecticut. Those are 3 of the wealthiest states in the country. So they may not be funding education in the most fair manner, but are getting exceptional outcomes. So just curious kind of what your research says there.
I'm going to get cut off here for hogging the microphone too much.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
I think that we have 50 states and 50 different approaches and 50 different education cultures. And so it's sort of hard to generalize. But I think one of the things I think that successful states do is they have what you might call a balanced portfolio. They're not trying to raise all the money or most of the money from one revenue source. They have an array of taxes, and they raise money from some of them, and so there's not a super reliance on one. And New Hampshire has a low tax burden that people appreciate, but what we have is a really out of whack tax portfolio. Our property taxes, the total amount of property taxes that we raise here, is higher than all of the other taxes we raise combined. The business taxes are less than $1 billion. The interest and dividends was $150 million. We raise, I think, in the neighborhood of $5 billion in property taxes. So we have a system that's very skewed. So I think places that have done it well have a variety of revenue sources. And there's a lot of debate about how, what's a way to have local contributions and local control and local opinions. And Representative Ames, who's here, has a very thoughtful perspective about that is derived in part from what they've done in Massachusetts. But so, we should, I think we have some work to do to try to figure out how we can raise this in a fair way and not lean so hard on property taxes. And people are suffering. It's a very quiet suffering about property taxes, and we need to address it.
Cool. Thank you.
I have a couple points. One is that having recently run for office, I did a lot of research on this, and we pay probably the lowest. We have the lowest per capita tax burden of all the states in the United States, except for New Hampshire, except for Alaska, which has an oil endowment that pays every citizen. So, in New Hampshire, we pay roughly $2,900 per year if you add up all the taxes. Like I said, this is the lowest of all the 50 states, except for Alaska. Second is that if you think that if you give out voucher money to students who don't go to public schools already, that you're not actually impacting public school budgets, that's a lie. Because you're taking away money that could be used to support public schools. And so any money that goes to schools that are not public, that may be religious or whatever, is taking away from the money that could support public education. And third, that there is a formula by which the New Hampshire can have we don't charge income tax, and still be fairer, and that is to make the property tax rate a sliding scale that is based on your income. Then you can only have a property tax, but it varies based on your income. And so if you happen to be earning $500,000 a year, which I'm not, then you will pay a higher property tax rate than the same person in your town who is living on Social Security and happen to inherit their house and cannot afford a property tax bill of $15,000 a year. So there are solutions that allow New Hampshire to say, we don't have an income tax, but make the property tax burden more fair. Because you're absolutely right. The basing school funding solely on property tax is grossly unfair and grossly regressive on those who can least afford to pay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Andrew Bell. This is a little off topic. I come from Iowa, where we did have pretty good equalization of taxes for school districts, which was great. But I also came from a district which is very similar to Conval in the number of students that are served and so on, but we had vastly different costs for educating each student. I got statistics, and we had the cost to educate a student, at least according to the data I had here, is $25,000. In the district I came from, it was $16,000. The number, and why is that? Well, part of it is that the student-teacher ratio in the district I came from was 14.5. Here it's under 10. then it makes a huge difference. And you think, oh, is this one of these districts where all the kids are failing and there's not a good education? And the answer is no. The kids had access to AP classes. The performance on standardized tests was very good or better than what we have here. And I think there are some things here in our district we may be able to do to lower our costs. I mean, I would hope it would be great if we could get equalization of funding, but I don't think we need to wait for equalization of funding in order to address potential issues and lower our tax burden here.
Thank you for the comments. It's difficult not knowing Iowa or the schools to compare it directly, but we do have a number of unique challenges in Conval relating to the costs.
Yeah, I will say, I know that the issue with having our schools, there was one elementary school in our district for about the same number, which is a big difference. But that it isn't unusual. If you look at cost to educate per pupil all around the country, this is still a very high cost, not just.
And we are by and large a high performing state too nationally. You know, we have very good educational outcomes here. So while residents do dig deep into their pockets to pay for the education, it pays off. You know, our kids are getting a good education.
And we have a certain structure here, which is creates a lower teacher to student ratio. You address the elementary schools. We have half the number of students that Bedford has, and half the number, and twice as many schools. So Bedford is educating twice as many students with half the number of schools that we have, and they're doing a good job. But that's not our structure that we have here. So that's a factor that we just have to be aware of, and that's where we're at. We have the elementary schools, we have the 2 middle schools, and we have the high school, and we put that up to the voters, and the voters decided that that's what we want to keep.
That wasn't going to reduce the cost, right?
Oh, it totally was going to reduce the cost.
Excuse me?
It was going to totally reduce the cost.
That's not what was reported. That was in the newspaper, in every single form. We asked, will the taxes go down? And the answer was, well, we'll give you extra programs. But you never said the taxes were going to go down.
Well, that may be the case that we didn't say the taxes were going to go down. The costs were going to go down. So if we were going to offer extra programs, excuse me, let me finish.
Okay.
If we were going to offer extra programs, that was because we were saving money. So the costs were going to go down. One of the possibilities was to spend more money on some of the other schools that we have. That doesn't mean we had to do that. We always go back to the voters. The voters always make the decision. We wanted to consolidate the costs. The costs would go down. There's no doubt about that.
No. All right.
Frank LeBlanc. So circling back to education freedom accounts, you said it's hard to find accountability with these. I know a lot of these students end up going to charter schools, private schools, even homeschooling. Do we know how they end up doing on standardized tests like the SAT, ACT, AP? I know that data is very sparse. I'm actually in education prep right now, but do we have any data really on how these students are doing after they leave public schools?
I don't believe they're required to take any standardized testing as public schools are.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think there's no reporting requirements. There's just, nobody's checking on how those kids are doing.
So they don't take NEWAs or the kneecap test?
They may take them, but nobody's gathering that data for every kid, and no one's calling up a parent, say, who's homeschooling and saying, looks like your kid is struggling in math. What can we do about that? Nobody's doing that.
So there's no baseline SAT data just from charter schools at all, or just?
I don't know about charter schools. Charter schools are different than
Sorry, that was on me. But. All right, thank you.
Go ahead.
My name is Eleanor Alborn Sue, and I'm an educator, and I live in the Jaffrey Ringe School District. This is a cautionary tale to everybody who is here. When we stress the taxpayers as much as we are stressing them, what happens at a deliberative meeting is that people show up and cut 10% out of your school budget. The cuts have been horrific. We are using our emergency funds. We'll be able to use them for 1 year. So pray God we don't have a bad storm that takes a roof out, because then we're in trouble. We are using those for 1 year to be able to cover incredible amounts of things that had to be taken out of the budget. This is what happens when people are that stressed. I did want to ask something because I'm unclear. With EFA accounts, how much do those families receive from the state in comparison to what a per pupil expenditure is? Is it the same or is it different?
It's the amount of the adequacy aid. So it's the, what do we had, the 5,995, like the average adequacy grant. That's a good benchmark. It would depend on if the student is eligible for like an IEP, or they're an English language learner, or they're on eligible for free and reduced price lunch. Those things determine what the actual amount that they would receive is.
And that's going to vary per town, or it's the same
per
across
student.
Per student.
Because it's
Okay.
the state pays the adequacy aid on a per pupil basis to districts, and so it pays the same amount of money to a student receiving an education freedom account. It's the same amount of money for the state.
And how long does that bridge happen? Is that for 1 year?
I
that the
believe
school district receives?
the phase out grant is
Phase
2
out?
years, but I don't remember. There was discussion about phasing out the phase out grants in this budget, but I don't want to speak definitively on that because I don't know.
I will just quickly share with the room that Jaffrey Ringe has the highest number, I believe, in the states of students that are receiving EFAs. Many of them are homeschooled. I know we have 114 students in Ringe alone who are receiving EFAs. So our district is doubly stressed. We are we are a rural district, and we are in really, really big trouble. We also just won some incredible awards for our high school. So we are high functioning, but we're in really, really big trouble. Thank you.
Patrick Armstrong, getting the focus back on funding rather than EFAs and that kind of thing. When do you expect any kind of ruling from the Supreme Court on this stuff?
Well, we are hoping to get rulings this summer. We have just been speculating about whether the court's been waiting till the end of the legislative session so that if they issue a ruling that says the state has to spend more, the legislature will essentially get another legislative session before they have to do it. That's just a guess. But I think I expect rulings this summer. One of the Supreme Court justices is retiring at the end of August, and I think that he will want to have the rulings out before he goes.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
My name is Paul Angelo. I'm from Temple. I think probably the biggest thing I'm going to walk away from here, and it's somewhat melancholy about it, is you made a comment, Joan. You said that the Massachusetts and Vermont, one word, legislature. And I think that's probably the biggest problem we have as far as getting more money is the legislature that we have in New Hampshire. I get a little bit dark sometimes with my humor, but I actually said to some friends, we were talking about this, and with a soccer team, that's a whole nother story at my age, but I kind of made the comment, I said, well, you have a better chance of getting rid of guns in the state than you will solving the school money problem, because I think people think more about the money, the people, especially the people that have a lot of money. and they've convinced the legislature what to do. So, and then I look at the amount of people that we have here that showed up for this, and it doesn't look like a very bright future for me.
There's two thoughts. One is that we have a democracy here, and we actually have a more accessible democracy in New Hampshire in some ways than a lot of other states. We have so many reps that we have one every couple of blocks.
Yeah.
And
swing
so
a
it's
cap.
easier to find them, and they don't have, this is a loss in some ways, but it's also, they don't have a whole bunch of legislative aides and other people in offices sort of protecting them. They are more accessible. They just haven't heard from us enough about property taxes. And I think there's circles of people who care about this. There are parents and who care about their kids. There are other people who, like me, their kids are long gone, but I still care about kids and their education. There's a big circle of people in New Hampshire who are really upset about the level of property taxes. And some of that is residents, some of it is businesses. Businesses in New Hampshire, if they own any property at all, pay far more in property taxes than they pay in business taxes. So we need to use our civic muscles and talk to those legislators and say, you've got to do something about this. And there are ideas. One of the things that people have talked about in terms of property taxes, what about giving everybody a homestead exemption where you don't pay property taxes on the first 100,000 or 150,000, only if it's your primary residence. But if it's your lake house, you don't get an exemption. So that property would pay the shift. There would be a shift of who pays those property taxes. So there's ways to do this, but the fundamental thing, it's an issue of our democracy, and I think we can do it. I think we can do it.
It's money. Is what it comes down to, is that the people, you would try and do something like that, and the people would just, the people with the money would lobby and get that out. I mean, lobby is one of the, and just from in the government point of view, going to Washington is one of the best investments, and the return on investment you can get is spending money lobbying.
Unfortunately, that's true. I thought a gentleman earlier had made a similar point to you, John, about somehow assessing someone's house and also trying to factor in the person's income. So it's another possible way to take the burden off some people who maybe are not capable of paying it, and yet that's the primary source of funding for the schools.
One other point that's really important is we're paying already. We are paying for the cost of schools. We're paying in our property taxes. We're paying that there's that $2.7 billion that the state should be paying that we're paying. So we don't necessarily need to spend a lot more money. We need to raise it differently. We need to raise it in a fair way.
But that's not really talked about in the election, in the election cycle. It's just not discussed. And then we end up, debating, the money and locally here. The one question I wanted to ask, but I don't want an answer because it's somewhat, I don't think this is the proper forum for it, but you look at what Conval is playing, from the numbers, the state numbers, they're now 23, 24, the $26,000, and you look at the surrounding towns, and they're, $6,000 to $8,000 less per student. So what can Conval do to try and flatten that out? And that will stop towns like Francistown, Dublin, and now Temple from maybe trying to leave the district. Because someone you can, there was a whole thing about leveraging the size of it, having it decide the economy and size. Is that, John, you made the comment that, well, Conval has different challenges as far as being, spread out in the district. So does that pose the other argument to say, well, maybe it would be better if Francistown left because they could do smaller? Just putting it out there. They don't necessarily want to debate that here and now, but you see where I'm going with that. Thank you.
A couple of things. First of all, my old hometown where I grew up and graduated from Stevens High School, Claremont, when I was a lad, we had one of the best districts in this state. And a lot of things happened, unfortunately, and now I look at my old hometown, it's a sad picture. And the tax rate in that town is so ridiculous, and what they struggle with compared to what we had. I look at this and then, not as much of a question, but in a way, our legislature, and I'd like, if anyone wants to address it, seems to, not all our legislature, but enough of them, seem to feel we don't really care too much about those kids in other parts of the state. And well, let's go Pittsburgh or over to Fitzwilliam or something like that. It's a game. It's been going on for decades in this state. And it bothers me. I taught here for years, and the kids got a real good education. Had I been up teaching in Colebrook or something, I don't think I would have seen the same picture. So the fairness part of it, that's what I love, the funding fairness around the state. It shouldn't matter whether I live in Newcastle or some other place. And so if you have an answer on that one, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that is what the Claremont Court said we should be doing. All of the students in the state are everyone's responsibility, not just the students in your school district. You know, your education should depend on your area code, not your zip code. Whereas it's a small state. You know I'm an anomaly. I grew up in Nashua. I moved back to Nashua after college. Not everyone does that. I could just have easily have lived in Manchester or Concord or Keene or Peterborough or Pittsburgh. You know, my education in Nashua is going to affect other communities. You know, people who go to school in, go to the technical center here, they don't just work in the 9 towns in this district. They get jobs all over the state. And the benefit and the intention of the Part 2, Article 83 in the New Hampshire Constitution is to ensure that all students are getting access to that education, because it benefits the entire state, not just the people in the community that live there. And Judge Ruoff touched on that in his Rand decision about the negative swept rates. You know, education benefits those people too, and so that is really I keep saying the Claremont promise. That's the ideal that we should be going for. Is they're all our kids. The court says they're all our kids, and we should be working to take care of all of them.
Thank you. Just very quickly, it just seems to me property taxes, the way we have them in this state, really affect how people want to act about schools. Property taxes, education. If you raise the taxes a little bit, it's your fault. And even though I know it's tough, but it sets kind of this confrontation, and I think that's a horrible thing. Thank you.
Hi, David Kidd. Another way I think that we haven't talked about, that nobody talks about in terms of making our property taxes more equitable and harnessing more property tax money, is reforming our current use law, which effectively subsidizes the largest, wealthiest landholders by giving them lower tax rates for keeping their woods, keeping their lakefront, keeping their meadows. There can be exceptions for the elderly. There can be exceptions for people whose properties are under 100 acres. At the moment, we're subsidizing John Malone's 26,000 acres up north. And even here in our towns, in our district, we're subsidizing lots of people who own more than 100 acres. And it drives everyone else's property taxes up, but it also makes property itself that's buildable more expensive than it would otherwise be because it allows people for very little money to keep property off of the market. In Hancock, we have 19,000 acres, 14,000 of it is in current use, which leaves 5,000 acres that are developable. It's part of the reason our school districts are shrinking because young families can't afford to live here. And it's part of the reason that so many taxpayers are frustrated because small landholders are being treated exactly the same way as large landholders by doing that. So, anyway.
So current use is, I'm very glad you raised that, because I just read something the other day about how Maine handles it. Maine, and the idea of current use was to preserve open space, preserve woods and farmland, and that's a wonderful policy. But what we do in New Hampshire is the state sets that policy and towns have no control. They have no control. And so an awful lot of land gets taken off the tax rolls, and that just means the burden is shifted to other people. In Maine, they're trying to do the same thing, preserve open space, but the state gives the town money to recompense the town for following that state policy of taking land off the tax rolls. That would be, it's a good policy. We need to pay for it. Yeah. Right. Well, if it reduces it by 90%, it's not entirely off the tax rolls, but it's significantly.
And if you have like wooded property and then you harvest the wood, you pay a fairly substantial tax on whatever the wood that you cut. And I will say, not everybody is rich. I mean, my husband and I bought 30 acres, and most of that is in current use, but most of that also is not buildable, and we've never been rich. I'm a nurse and he was an engineer, we're not making a ton of money.
Exemptions for under 100 acres.
Yeah.
And for income rates and
Yeah.
all kinds of different.
And the other thing that I wanted to say was, maybe 20 years ago-ish, maybe, there was somebody running from around here for the legislature whose idea for like school funding was that there would be like the property tax, but there would be an exemption on your primary residence. You wouldn't pay property tax like up to a certain level. And also he was proposing an income tax, but only like for like a really high income, kind of like a really top marginal tax. And that money would go to funding schools, and by his calculations, it would have provided a good education and significantly lowered the property taxes for everybody. But, this is New Hampshire. We can't possibly have a high property tax and an income tax.
Yeah, real quick. We're gonna wrap it up. So if you're okay, if you have any questions, please make them quick. Our speakers have they don't live locally. They have an hour drive home.
I just want to point out that the towns that are particularly burdened by this are rural small towns, because you cannot have half a school. You have a school or no school. So if your student population goes down by 10 kids, you cannot reduce your budget by 10% because you have to have a whole school. And so what's really killing a lot of the issue here is small rural towns are being unfairly burdened because they have to provide a whole school. Whereas Bedford and other towns, there's a significant enough population to justify that. And there's economies of scale. And in rural New Hampshire, we don't have them. But we cannot have no school. I mean, so we set up this conflict, and that's why the fairness in education is so important, particularly for rural towns. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll add one thing to that. The state during the Conval trial, the way the legislature picked the number for base adequacy, they did a report in 2008, but they didn't put the number. They just put the number from the report into law. They didn't put any of the things that got them to the number in the law, so we just got the number. But in that report, they say you should have a guidance counselor for every 400 students. As an example, everything is broken down per pupil. That's how you end up with each student gets $4,000 going towards teachers. It adds up over all the teachers. I forget who was on the witness stand for the state, but they were asked, how many guidance counselors do you need if you have 401 students? You need 2 guidance counselors to hit the standard, but that second guidance counselor, you're only getting 1 student's worth of the funding towards that second guidance counselor. So economies of scale do play a huge role in that for sure, and it's just the way that our funding system doesn't account for those differences.
Rashay Colcom, thank you. I've written down several notes here based on the conversation and some of the slides that were made. So there's a few things, if I may, I'd like to tap into. One is, you showed that Antrim's cost per, the revenue per student that they were getting from the state was roughly around $4,500, if I remember correctly. It's on my phone, I took a picture of it. But anyways, I just looked at the reports that were provided to me from the Department of Revenue, Department of Education rather, and Conval's been getting over $8,000 per student, so, and that includes SWEPT. So I'm not sure why there's a discrepancy in the numbers, but there's clearly a discrepancy.
So that graph just shows the adequacy aid. There are other state funds that go out, but for a lot of districts, they are not as significant as they are for Conval. But that graph was just showing the adequacy aid only, the difference between what the state says and adequate education costs, and then the actual cost of delivering that education.
But there's a lot of extra money that's coming out through other grants to all of our school districts that really makes a difference. And I think that if you're going to talk about the funding that's coming through the state, they should hear about all of the funding that's coming through the state, maybe and not just little pieces of it. Which brings me to HB 675, where again, we talked about the tax cap on HB 675, and you showed only a little snippet of that, but HB 675 as amended would only impose a tax cap if 2/3 of the legislative body of that community voted for that tax cap. It was not an automatic tax cap. It required 2/3 vote as opposed to 1/2 plus 1.
That was the override provision required a 2/3 vote, not, it would impose a tax cap on all communities. The 2/3 is the override for the tax cap. That in HB 675, as it was, I think you have it flipped. That was the requirement to override the tax cap was a 2/3 vote.
All right, if I do have that flipped, I apologize. Talking about the the EFAs, and you guys brought up skiing, and we were talking about the adequacy, what is a proper adequate education, and somebody brought up sports equipment. Currently, skiing is funded through our schools. Our ski teams are funded through our schools. An adequate education really did not provide for after-school activities. We voters actually have provided that by saying yes to the budgets. But when we talk about the EFAs and the students who are using them to get ski passes, that's really the equivalent of a phys ed class or of an after-school skiing program that all of these students here are eligible to take. We talked about the proficiency of the students of the EFAs and that there's not testing. There is statute that does say that they have to take one of 3 tests, but let's talk about Conval's proficiency. Our math proficiency finished at 41%, which means 39% of our students are not, 59% of our students are not proficient in math. Science, 33% finished with a proficient level, which means roughly 70% of our kids are not proficient in science graduating from this school district. And then English language learners, English is our primary language here in the United States, 56% passed at a proficient level, leaving roughly 40% of our students not proficient in English. So when you're talking about the success of our students, I'm all for it. But the test scores within our school district are not meeting the mark and leaving it. So when we're worrying about what our EFAs are doing and what our homeschoolers are doing, there are tests. They have to take one of 3 tests. They are required by law to take one of 3 tests. I guess it remains to be seen whether the scholarship company is watching that. We will follow up on that. But there certainly is some question when we're paying $60 million a year for 1,936 students, which is what basically Conval's budget is for their 1,936 students. And by the way, if people aren't aware, Conval's lost 100 students in the last 4 years based off of the state's reporting of education. I mean, there's a huge question. are we looking at spending? You guys talk about bringing in more money, more money, more money, but who is talking about how the money's being spent? We have 107 SAUs in this state. We're spending over $100 million on our SAUs. We have 46 SAUs that have less than 1,000 students in them. I think we could be looking at maybe consolidating some of our SAUs. I know you showed up there that, I think it was in Pembroke, they were looking at getting rid of an SAU to try to meet the adequacy. Problem with SAUs for a lot of us taxpayers is that we don't have an opportunity to vote individually on their budget or at a deliberative session with their budget. The SAU budget gets put into our school budget, and the only thing we can do is either zero out that line or accept it at deliberative session. There's no ability to take apart the line items of the SAUs. Conval, up until last year, had the 4th highest paid superintendent. There's a lot of spending that's going on. Currently, your superintendent is the 15th highest paid in the state. So, you know, I would like to know what you guys are looking at as far as our spending and how to control our spending and in what areas we can do to improve that.
Okay, thank you. That was quite a lot. I want to go back to test scores really quick. We are looking at testing, looking at state testing, and looking at how it is the state and we as a school go about assessing the quality of an education and how we measure that, and we would like that to be measured versus how the state does. And I hope that's a discussion we can bring back to this forum within the next year. So I hope you come back for that. We, as a board, as an administration, and as a community, are constantly grappling with the difficulties of costs and the effects on taxpayers, and balancing that with the kids here. There's a lot on the table. Our Budget and Property Committee is considering deep dives in a number of areas, transportation, anything we can do for special education costs. We have a board goals meeting next week, and we will be bringing that, as the administration and the board develop a budget, that will be brought back here to this stage in the boardroom via public hearings, and we will continue to have those conversations with the public numerous times, and I hope you come back to dive into that, not at a 9 o'clock hour. Molly, would you like to speak?
I'd just like to make a wrapping up comment. And in my research on this, I found, you showed a slide earlier saying that we are one of the highest spending states. But at the state level, we are 50th. And I just wanted to clarify that, because to me, that's the outcomes are we're in the top 10 always, usually top 5. And what that proves to me is that we value education, and we've been digging deeply into our pockets, paying property taxes to support an excellent education for the children in our state largely. So if there's a way to leverage that valuation of education to find other funding, I really think it should be at the state level, but other funding to support it so that we're not digging so deeply into our property pockets. So thanks for your work on that.
Thanks. Thank you everyone for coming.